The pain came before the sound, a white flash across my cheek, then the crack of it, reaching my own ears a half-second late, like the universe itself was embarrassed to admit what had just happened. My name is Elena Vance, and 3 seconds ago I was standing in a training hall on a space station that did not belong to my species, correcting an alien officer in front of 40 cadets. Now my head was turned sideways, my lip was bleeding, and something in me that had been sleeping for 26 years opened its eyes. Let me back up, because none of this makes sense without the weeks before it. 6 months earlier, Earth had signed its name to something called the Coalition Charter, a treaty between 11 species who had been fighting wars, trading resources, and making alliances across the stars long before humans figured out how to leave low orbit. We were the newest members. The youngest, the smallest fleet, the least advanced weapons, the shortest history of interstellar travel. Every alien delegate who shook a human hand did it the way you shake the hand of a child who just learned to tie their shoes. Polite, careful, a little amused. I did not care about any of that. I cared about one thing: getting into the Coalition Officer Training Program, the first class that would ever include humans, and proving that my species belonged in that room. I made the cut. Out of 9,000 applicants from Earth, only 40 of us were selected. I still remember the message arriving on my terminal, the government seal spinning slowly before the words appeared. I read it 4 times before I let myself believe it. Then I called my mother, and she cried, and I promised her I would come home with a rank attached to my name. 3 weeks later, I was on a transport ship leaving Earth's atmosphere for the first time, staring out a window at a planet shrinking into a blue marble, wondering if I had just made the best decision of my life or the worst one. The training station was called Cassandra, a massive ring of metal and light orbiting a star that was not our sun, built by a species called the Veil, centuries before humans had figured out electricity. The Veil ran most of Coalition military training. They were an old species, disciplined, quiet, and famous across known space for never showing their faces. Every Veil officer wore a mask, smooth and gray, fitted so perfectly to their features that it looked like a second layer of skin rather than something they put on in the morning. Nobody outside their species had ever seen what was underneath. There were rumors, of course. Cadets from other worlds whispered theories in the mess hall, each one wilder than the last. Some said the Veil had no faces at all, just smooth skin where eyes should be. Others said their true faces were so disfigured by centuries of war that they hid them out of shame. My roommate, a soft-spoken cadet from a species called the Oran, told me the real answer was much simpler and much older. The mask was not about hiding anything, she said. It was about power. In Veil culture, showing your bare face to someone was considered the deepest form of vulnerability there was, reserved only for family, for mates, for moments of complete trust. To keep the mask on in front of us was the Veil way of saying we had not earned that trust, and never would. It was not fear. It was a wall, built out of respect for no one but themselves. I did not think much of it at the time. I had bigger problems. Coalition officer training was harder than anything I had done in my life, and I had grown up running obstacle courses before sunrise and studying tactics until my eyes burned. This was different. This was learning an entirely new language of combat, strategy, and survival, taught by species who had thousands of years of war behind them and absolutely no patience for anyone who needed a lesson twice. Our lead combat instructor was a Veil officer named Threx Kalanor. He was tall, even by Veil standards, with a voice that came out flat and metallic through the mask's built-in translator. He walked through our ranks the way a sculptor walks around a block of stone, deciding what to cut away. From the very first day, Threx made his opinion of human cadets clear without ever needing to say it out loud. He corrected our stances with a kind of theatrical patience, the way you would correct a toddler holding a spoon the wrong way. He answered our questions in short, clipped sentences, as if every word he spent on us was a small tax he resented paying. When a Veil cadet stumbled through a drill, he offered calm, detailed feedback. When a human cadet stumbled, he sighed, long and audible, loud enough for the whole room to hear. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself I was here to learn, not to be liked. I put my head down and worked twice as hard as anyone else in my squad, staying in the training hall long after the lights dimmed for the night cycle, running drills alone until my muscles screamed and my mind went quiet. It earned me nothing but more scrutiny. There was a cadet in my squad named Daniel Cross, a broad-shouldered man from a coastal town back on Earth who had been a firefighter before he applied to the program. Daniel had a habit of asking questions that made instructors uncomfortable, not because they were disrespectful, but because they were sharp. He asked Threx once why Veil combat doctrine assumed every opponent would break under sustained pressure within 90 seconds. It was a fair question. Human bodies, human minds, did not always work that way. Threx answered him with 2 sentences and a look that suggested the question itself was an insult. I liked Daniel. I liked Grace Holloway too, a quiet, precise cadet from a small farming community who had scored higher than anyone else in our class on tactical simulations, human or alien. And I liked Owen Bennett, who made terrible jokes at the worst possible moments and somehow kept all of us sane during the hardest weeks. We became something like a family, the way people do when they are thrown into an impossible situation together. We ate meals at the same table. We studied in the same corner of the station library, a room built for 11 different species with furniture that fit none of us comfortably. We complained about Threx in low voices, careful never to let it reach anyone who might report it. Because here is the thing nobody warned us about before we left Earth. In the coalition military, the chain of command was treated as something close to sacred. Species who had been part of this alliance for centuries did not question their instructors, did not argue, did not push back, not because they agreed with everything, but because their cultures had built in, from birth, an instinct toward obedience that made confrontation almost physically uncomfortable for them. Humans did not have that instinct. Not really. We had built our entire history on people who refused to stay quiet when something was wrong. It was in our stories, our songs, our laws. It was the thing that had gotten us to the stars in the first place. Slower than everyone else, but here, nonetheless. Threx did not understand that about us. None of the instructors did. They had trained hundreds of species before humans arrived, and every single one of those species had, eventually, learned to lower their eyes when a superior officer raised their voice. We did not lower our eyes, and it was starting to become a problem. 3 weeks before the day my life changed, Threx pulled Daniel out of a squad exercise in front of everyone and told him, flatly, that human cadets lacked the discipline necessary for command roles, and that our species had likely been led into the coalition more out of political courtesy than genuine merit. He said it the way you would state a fact about the weather. Daniel did not say anything back. He stood there, jaw tight, hands at his sides, and took it, because that was what we had been trained to do, over and over, since the first day we arrived on Cassandra. I watched that happen from across the training hall, and something in my chest went cold and still. That night, in the mess hall, Grace asked me quietly if I thought it would ever get better. I told her I did not know. I told her that maybe this was just the price of being new, of being the youngest species in the room, and that we had to prove ourselves before anyone would treat us differently. I believed that, for a while. I believed it right up until the moment Threx's hand connected with my face in front of the entire squad, and every quiet thing I had swallowed for 3 months came rushing up at once, with nowhere left to go. It happened during a tactics drill, the kind we ran almost every day, where 2 cadets faced off in a simulated engagement while the rest of the squad watched, and Threx narrated our mistakes for everyone to hear. That day, it was my turn against a cadet from a species called the Baron, heavier built than a human, built for grinding endurance rather than speed. I lost the simulation, not because my strategy was wrong, but because Threx had set the parameters of the exercise to favor exactly the kind of prolonged, grinding confrontation that barren physiology was built for, and human physiology was not. I said so, once the simulation ended, calmly, the way I had been taught to raise concerns in any professional setting back on Earth. I did not accuse him of anything. I simply pointed out that the scenario assumed all species recovered stamina at the same rate, which was not true, and that a better instructor would have adjusted the parameters accordingly. The room went very quiet. Threx turned toward me slowly, the mask's blank gray surface somehow managing to convey more disdain than any human face ever could. He told me that questioning the structure of a training exercise was not my place. I told him, still calm, still measured, that I was not questioning his authority, only the fairness of the scenario, and that a good instructor should welcome that kind of feedback rather than punish it. I do not know, even now, exactly which words tipped him over the edge. Maybe it was not the words at all. Maybe it was simply the fact that a human cadet, the newest, smallest, least respected species in the entire coalition, had looked him directly in the visor and refused to back down. His hand moved faster than I could track. And then my head was turned sideways, my lip was bleeding, and the sound of the strike was still echoing off the training hall walls. For one full second, I did nothing. The shock of it held me completely still, the way cold water holds you still the instant you fall into it, before your body remembers how to move. Then something older than 3 months of training took over. Something that did not care about chains of command or coalition protocol or the careful, patient version of myself I had been building since the day I arrived on this station. My hand shot out and closed around the edge of Threx's mask. I did not plan it. I did not think about what would happen next, or what it would mean, or whether it was even physically possible. I simply grabbed the nearest thing to me, the way anyone does when their body is running purely on instinct, and I pulled. The mask came apart in my hand. Not bent, not cracked at the edges the way you would expect from something built to withstand the wars of an ancient warrior species. It came apart, clean and sudden, like it had never been designed to survive contact with anything at all. The training hall went completely silent. 40 cadets from 11 different worlds stood frozen, staring at me, at the broken mask in my fist, and at the face of Threx Kalanor, exposed for the first time in front of anyone who was not Vale. I would spend a long time afterward trying to describe what I saw in that half-second before the alarm started screaming. But in that moment, all I understood was one simple, impossible fact. I had just broken something that was never supposed to break, and nothing that happened after that day would ever let me forget it. The alarm started 3 seconds after the mask hit the floor. Not loud, blaring alarms like the ones from Earth movies I used to watch as a kid. Cassandra's alert system was quieter than that, almost gentle, a rising 3-note chime that repeated through the training hall speakers while the ceiling lights shifted from white to a deep amber. It was somehow worse than a siren. It sounded calm, controlled, the way a parent's voice sounds right before they tell you something has gone very wrong. I did not move. I could not move. My hand was still half raised, the broken pieces of the mask scattered near my boots, and every single cadet in that hall was staring at the same thing I was staring at. Threx's face. I had imagined, somewhere in the back of my mind, that the Veil might look monstrous underneath their masks, or strange in a way that would explain centuries of hiding. What I saw instead was almost unbearably ordinary, which somehow made it worse. His skin was pale gray, smooth, marked with faint lines that ran from his temples down toward his jaw like the veins of a leaf. His eyes were larger than a human's, dark and liquid, and in that first frozen second, they were not angry, they were something closer to naked, something closer to afraid. Then the fear vanished, replaced by a fury so complete it seemed to change the temperature of the room. Threx brought one hand up to cover the lower half of his face, an instinctive, almost childlike gesture that looked strange on a being who moments earlier had struck me without a flicker of hesitation. His other hand slammed down on the control panel beside him, and the amber lights pulsed brighter. "Security to Training Hall 4, he said, and his voice without the mask's translator sounded raw, unfiltered, a language I did not understand, layered underneath the words the station's systems were converting into something I could follow. Immediate lockdown. Immediate lockdown. The doors at both ends of the hall sealed with a heavy mechanical sound, the kind of sound that makes your stomach drop because you know, instantly, that you are not walking out of this room until someone else decides you can. Around me, my squad had gone completely still. Daniel stood a few feet to my left, his hands raised slightly, palms open, in the universal posture of someone trying very hard not to look like a threat. Grace had gone pale, her eyes flicking between me and the door. Owen had actually taken a step backward, which under any other circumstances would have made me laugh, because Owen never stepped backward from anything. Nobody said my name. Nobody said anything at all. I looked down at my hand and realized, distantly, that I was still holding a piece of the mask. A curved section of gray material, lighter than I expected, warm from where it had rested against Threx's skin. I set it down slowly, deliberately, on the floor in front of me, the way you set down a weapon when someone finally convinces you to surrender. It did not help. 6 security officers came through the far door within 90 seconds, 3 of them Vale, 2 Baron, 1 from a species I did not recognize with 4 arms and skin like polished stone. They moved fast, faster than I had seen anyone move on this station, faster than the slow, patient pace that had defined every single day of training since I arrived. They did not go for the door I might have run toward. They did not go for the other cadets. They came straight for me, and I understood, with a clarity that cut through the fog of shock, that whatever happened next was going to happen to me alone. "Step back from the instructor," one of the Baron officers said, her voice deep and rumbling even through the translator. "Hands where they can be seen." I raised my hands. I did not resist. Some distant, disciplined part of my brain, the part that had gotten me through 9,000 other applicants and 3 months of brutal training, understood that resisting now would only make everything worse. But my legs were shaking, and my lip was still bleeding, a thin line of red I could taste at the corner of my mouth, and I had never in my life felt so completely alone in a room full of people. Threx had not moved from beside the control panel. His hand was still pressed against his face, though I noticed, in the space of a heartbeat, that his fingers had loosened slightly, as if some part of him had already accepted there was nothing left to hide. The rest of the Vale in the room, 3 officers who had entered with security, kept their eyes carefully averted from him, staring instead at the far wall, at the floor, anywhere but at their exposed colleague. It was, I would learn later, a reflex almost as deep as breathing. You did not look at a Vale's bare face unless they chose to show it to you. Even now, even in chaos, that rule held. Nobody averted their eyes from me. The security officers formed a loose ring around me, close enough that I understood exactly how outnumbered I was, but not so close that they were touching me. One of the Vale officers, older than the others, with lines around his mask that suggested decades of service, stepped forward and studied me for a long moment through the smooth gray surface that covered his own face. "Cadet Vance," he said finally, reading the name from a badge on my uniform rather than asking me. "You will come with us." I looked past him, once, at Daniel, at Grace, at Owen, at all the faces of the squad I had trained beside for 3 months. Nobody said goodbye. Nobody said anything encouraging. What I saw on their faces instead was something I recognized immediately, because I had felt it myself only minutes earlier, watching Daniel take Threx's insult without flinching. Fear, not for me, for themselves. For what this might mean for every human cadet on this station, now that one of us had broken the unbreakable in front of 40 witnesses from 10 different worlds. They walked me out of the training hall in that tight formation, security officers on every side, and the corridor beyond was already full of cadets and staff who had heard the alarm and come to see what happened. I felt every eye on me as we passed. Some of the faces were curious, some were openly hostile. A few, mostly other human cadets from different squads who I barely knew, looked at me with something that might have been admiration, quickly hidden the moment a Vale officer glanced their way. Nobody spoke to me during the walk. The corridors of Cassandra were built on a scale meant to accommodate a dozen different body types, wide and tall, with soft indirect lighting that usually made the station feel almost peaceful. Today it felt like the inside of a machine that had decided to swallow me whole. They brought me to a holding room 3 levels below the training decks, a bare space with gray walls, a single bench, and a door that sealed behind me with the same heavy, final sound as the training hall doors had. Nobody explained what would happen next. Nobody told me how long I would be there. The light stayed at a steady clinical brightness, and there was no way to tell how much time was passing. No window, no clock, nothing but the sound of my own breathing and the dull throb in my split lip. I sat on the bench and pressed the back of my hand against my mouth, and for the first time since the strike landed, I let myself shake. I do not know how long I sat there before the door opened again. Long enough that my legs had gone stiff from sitting still. Long enough that the adrenaline had burned off and left something colder and heavier in its place. When the door finally opened, it was not security who walked in. It was Captain Miriam Hale, the senior human liaison officer assigned to Cassandra, a woman in her 50s, with silver threaded through dark hair and a face that had clearly spent years learning to hide whatever she was actually feeling. She had been on the station since the first human cadets arrived, the closest thing any of us had to an advocate inside a system built entirely by species who were not ours. She sat down across from me without saying anything at first, studying my face, my split lip, the dried blood I had not been given anything to clean. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said finally. "Every detail. Do not leave anything out, and do not soften anything for my sake." So I told her. I told her about the drill, about the parameters that favored barren endurance over human recovery rates, about raising the concern calmly, professionally, the way I had been trained to do in every leadership course back on Earth. I told her about the strike, the sound of it reaching my ears a half-second after the pain did, and the way my hand had moved without my permission, closing around the mask before I had made any conscious decision to do so. She listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable, until I got to the part about the mask coming apart in my hand. "It just broke," I said. "I didn't hit him. I didn't even pull that hard. It just came apart, like it wasn't built for anything at all." Something shifted in Captain Hale's expression then, something I could not quite name. Not disbelief, something closer to recognition, as if I had just confirmed a suspicion she had been carrying for a long time and hoping never to have proven. "That mask," she said slowly, "is rated to withstand a direct hit from war-grade armor. It has survived engagements that killed the Vale soldier wearing it. There is no record, in over 3 centuries of coalition history, of one being damaged by an unarmed strike from any species." I stared at her. Then how did I break it? Captain Hale did not answer right away. She looked at me for a long moment, at the blood on my lip, at my hands, still faintly trembling in my lap, and when she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, almost careful, as if she were choosing each word with more weight than usual. "That," she said, "is exactly the question every species on this station is asking right now. And I think, Cadet Vance, you are about to find out that the answer matters a great deal more than anyone expected." She stood, smoothing down her uniform, and for the first time since she had walked into the room, I saw something close to a smile at the corner of her mouth, brief and complicated, and gone almost as soon as it appeared. "There is going to be a tribunal," she said. "Full coalition review, all 11 species represented. Threx has already filed a formal complaint against you for striking a superior officer. My stomach dropped. I didn't strike him. I grabbed his mask. I know, she said. But right now, on paper, all anyone knows is that a human cadet damaged Vale property beyond repair and left a senior instructor without his mask in front of 40 witnesses. That is going to be a very difficult story to tell in your favor, unless we can find a way to tell a different one first. She walked to the door, then paused, one hand resting against the frame. Get some rest if you can, she said. Tomorrow, everyone on this station is going to want an explanation for what happened in that training hall. And I have a feeling, Elena, that you are not the only one who is about to be asked some very uncomfortable questions. The door closed behind her with the same heavy finality as before, and I was alone again in the small gray room, listening to my own heartbeat slow, staring at the dried blood on the back of my hand, and wondering what exactly I had unleashed the moment that mask came apart in my fist. They came for me again the next morning, before the station's artificial dawn cycle had even finished brightening the corridors. 2 security officers, neither of them the same ones from the day before, escorted me from the holding room to a part of Cassandra I had never seen. The cadet decks were built for comfort and training. This section was built for judgment. The Coalition Tribunal Chamber sat at the very center of the station, a circular room 3 stories tall, ringed with balconies where delegates from all 11 member species could observe proceedings from their preferred distance and lighting conditions. The Baron liked it cold and dim. The Oran liked it bright and warm. Every species had adjusted a small section of that ring to their own comfort, which meant the chamber as a whole looked like a patchwork of different worlds stitched together around a single stage. And standing at the center of that stage, waiting for me, was exactly where I did not want to be. Captain Hale met me at the entrance, dressed in a formal uniform I had not seen before, dark blue with silver at the collar. She looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from staying up all night, reading through regulations most people never open. Say as little as possible, she told me quietly, as we walked toward the center platform. Answer only what is asked. Do not explain yourself, unless directly requested to. And Elena, whatever you do not apologize for defending yourself. The moment you apologize, they will treat it as an admission. I wasn't planning to apologize, I said. I didn't do anything wrong. She gave me a look that was somewhere between approval and worry. I know. Just remember that not everyone in that room is going to agree with you. The chamber was already filling when we arrived. I recognized some faces from my training squad, seated in a section reserved for witnesses. Daniel gave me a small nod as I passed. Grace's hands were folded tightly in her lap. Owen, for once, was not smiling at all. Threx sat on the opposite side of the platform, and it took me a full second to recognize him, because he was wearing a new mask, identical to the one I had broken, smooth and gray, and utterly blank. Whatever the veil had seen underneath that mask stayed hidden again, sealed away like it had never been exposed at all, except that everyone in that room now knew it had been, and no mask could undo that. The tribunal was overseen by a panel of 7 judges, one from each of the largest member species, seated on a raised platform above the rest of the chamber. At the center sat a Vale administrator named Doran Ilyath, older than any Vale I had seen so far, his mask marked with faint etched patterns that I would later learn indicated decades of senior service. He called the proceedings to order with a voice that carried through the chamber without needing to be raised. This tribunal convenes to review an incident occurring in Training Hall 4, Administrator Doran said, involving Instructor Threx Kalinor and Cadet Elena Vance of the human delegation. We will hear testimony from both parties, from witnesses present, and from technical assessment of the damaged equipment. This is a formal coalition proceeding. All species present are reminded that findings here will carry binding weight. Binding weight. I felt Captain Hale's hand briefly touch my shoulder, a small, steadying gesture, before she stepped back to take her place among the observers. Threx was called first. He stood, and his new mask gave nothing away. No flicker of expression, no hint of what he had looked like in that unguarded second before he covered his face. He described the incident in flat, careful language. A training exercise had been conducted according to standard protocol. Cadet Vance had challenged the fairness of the exercise in a manner he considered insubordinate. He had administered a corrective strike, a practice he described as an accepted disciplinary method used across multiple species in the coalition for centuries. In response, Cadet Vance had assaulted him, damaging coalition property and exposing him without consent in front of 40 witnesses. I felt my jaw tighten with every sentence. It was not exactly a lie, but it was a version of events shaped so carefully around the truth that it left out everything that actually mattered. "You describe striking Cadet Vance as a corrective measure," Administrator Doran said when Threx finished. "Was this strike consistent with training protocols established for human cadets specifically?" There was a pause before Threx answered. "Human cadets are held to the same disciplinary standards as all other species in the program." "That was not my question," Doran said, his voice unchanged, but something in the careful precision of it made the chamber go very still. "Human physiology differs significantly from every other species currently enrolled in this program. Was the strike calibrated with that difference in consideration?" Another pause, longer this time. No specific calibration was applied. A quiet murmur moved through the balconies, quickly hushed. I was called next. Captain Hale had warned me not to explain myself unless asked, and I held on to that instruction like a rope in deep water. I described the training exercise, the parameters that favored barren endurance, the calm, professional tone I had used to raise the concern. I described the strike, and I described, as plainly as I could, exactly how the mask had come apart in my hand without any deliberate effort on my part. "I did not intend to damage coalition property," I said, when Doran asked me directly whether I understood the significance of what I had done. "I reacted to being struck. I grabbed the nearest object. I did not know it would break. If I had known, I still don't know what else I would have done differently, because in that moment, I was not thinking about protocol. I was thinking about the fact that someone had just hit me, and every instinct I have told me not to simply stand there and accept it." The chamber was silent after that. I could not read most of the alien faces watching me, not with any confidence, but I felt the weight of their attention settle over me like a physical thing. "You made no attempt to apologize or submit, following the strike," one of the other judges said, a delegate from a species called the Cathari, whose translated voice carried a faint musical quality even through its flatness. "Is that an accurate characterization?" "Yes," I said. "That's accurate. Why not?" I thought about Captain Hale's warning, about answering only what was asked, but this question deserved more than a short answer, and something in me refused to shrink from it now, after everything that had already happened. "Because where I come from," I said, "submitting to violence isn't considered wisdom. It's considered surrender. My species didn't get to the stars by learning to lower our eyes when someone stronger raised a hand against us. We got here by refusing to accept that being smaller, or younger, or newer, meant we had to accept unfair treatment quietly. I understand that might be different from how other species in this room were raised, but it is not wrong. It's simply human." I do not know what I expected after saying that. Punishment, maybe. A reprimand for speaking too freely in a proceeding that was supposed to be about facts, not feelings. Instead, what happened was something I had not anticipated at all. Daniel Cross stood up from the witness section. He had not been called. He had not been given permission. But he stood, and the room turned toward him, and after a brief pause, Administrator Doran gestured for him to speak, apparently deciding that whatever was about to happen was worth hearing. "I'd like to add testimony," Daniel said, "about a similar incident 3 weeks ago." He described, in careful detail, the day Threx had pulled him from a squad exercise and told him, in front of everyone, that humans lacked the discipline necessary for command and had likely been let into the coalition out of political courtesy rather than genuine merit. He described standing there and taking it, the way we had all been trained to do, because that was what every instructor on this station had taught us was expected of a good cadet. When he finished, Grace stood too, without being asked, and described a different incident, a training session where a Vale instructor had refused to adjust equipment sized for taller, broader species, resulting in 2 human cadets sustaining minor injuries during a routine exercise, injuries that were noted in the official record as cadet error rather than equipment failure. Then Owen stood and told a story I had never even heard before, about a night session where he had asked a legitimate technical question and been dismissed with a comment suggesting humans should be grateful simply to be included at all, regardless of how they were treated once they arrived. One by one, cadets I recognized, and some I did not, began to speak, some standing, some simply calling out from their seats, once it became clear the tribunal was, for whatever reason, allowing this. It was not organized. Nobody had planned it. It was simply months of quiet frustration, finally finding a room willing to listen, and once the first person stood, it seemed impossible for the rest to stay seated. Administrator Doran let it continue for a long time before finally raising a hand, and the chamber settled slowly back into silence. This tribunal was convened to examine a single incident, he said. It appears to have uncovered a broader pattern that extends well beyond one instructor or one cadet. He turned toward the panel beside him, and for the first time since the proceedings began, I saw something that looked almost like uncertainty pass between the judges, a brief exchange of glances that no translator could fully capture. "We will recess," Doran said finally, "to review the technical assessment of the damaged equipment and to determine the scope of this inquiry going forward. This tribunal is not concluded. It has, I believe, only just begun to ask the right questions." The chamber erupted into overlapping conversation the moment the recess was announced, dozens of voices from a dozen different worlds, all trying to make sense of what had just happened. Security moved to escort me back toward the holding area, but this time, as we walked, I noticed something different in the way the crowd watched me go. Fewer hostile stares. More something else, something that looked unmistakably like the beginning of respect, mixed with a wariness that had not existed in this station before yesterday. Captain Hale caught up to me just before I was led through the chamber doors, falling into step beside the security escort long enough to lean close and speak quietly near my ear. "Whatever happens next," she said, "you should know that broken mask of yours did more than expose one instructor's face. It cracked something a lot bigger than that, and I don't think this station or this coalition is ever going to look at your species quite the same way again." I did not feel triumphant hearing that. Mostly I felt exhausted and afraid of what still lay ahead, and strangely, distantly proud of Daniel and Grace and Owen for standing up when nobody asked them to. The doors closed behind me, sealing away the noise of the chamber, and I walked back toward the small gray room that had become, in the space of one impossible day, the closest thing I had to a place to think. The recess lasted 3 days, and every hour of it felt longer than the one before. They did not return me to the small gray room this time. Instead, Captain Hale arranged for me to stay in a modest guest quarters near the human cadet decks, technically still under restriction, but with enough freedom to eat in the mess hall, to walk the corridors under escort, to see the faces of people who had, until 3 days ago, been simply my squad mates, and were now something closer to witnesses in a case that seemed to be growing larger by the hour. Word of the tribunal had spread through Cassandra faster than any official report could have managed. By the second day, I could feel it in the way people looked at me in the corridors. Some cadets from other species crossed to the far side of the hallway when they saw me coming, as if proximity to whatever I had done might be contagious. Others, mostly younger cadets, watched me with open curiosity, the kind of look you give someone who has done something you are not sure you should admire, but cannot quite stop yourself from admiring anyway. Daniel found me on the second evening, sitting alone at the edge of the observation deck that looked out over Cassandra's slow, endless orbit around a star that was not ours. He sat down beside me without asking, the way he always did, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. "You didn't have to stand up," I said eventually. "In the tribunal, neither did Grace or Owen." "I know," Daniel said, "but somebody was going to have to say something eventually. Might as well have been us. They could have used it against you. Insubordination, disrupting a formal proceeding, any number of things." Daniel shrugged, watching the stars slide past the observation window. "Funny thing about fear," he said. "It only works as long as you're more scared of the consequences than you are of staying silent." I stopped being more scared of the consequences about the same time Threx told me my whole species didn't belong here. I did not have an answer for that. I just sat with him a while longer, the two of us watching the quiet turning of the station against the dark, until he finally stood, gave my shoulder a light, steadying squeeze, and left me to my thoughts. On the third day, Captain Hale came to my quarters early, before the artificial dawn had fully brightened the corridors, and told me the tribunal was reconvening within the hour. Her expression was harder to read than usual, careful in a way that told me she was holding something back, whether to protect me or simply because she was not yet certain how to explain it herself. "The technical assessment came back," she said, as we walked, "on the mask. And? I'll let them tell you," she said. "But Elena, whatever they say in there, I need you to stay steady. This is bigger than one broken piece of equipment now. I think you already knew that." The chamber was more crowded than before when we arrived, delegates and observers from every level of the station packed into the balconies, drawn by whatever version of the story had spread fastest through the corridors. Threx sat in his place again, mask intact, posture rigid. Daniel, Grace, and Owen sat together in the witness section, and this time they were joined by nearly a dozen other human cadets I recognized from different squads across the training program, all of them present. All of them, I understood without needing to be told, ready to stand again if it came to that. Administrator Doran called the chamber to order, and the low murmur of conversation faded into a tense, expectant silence. "This tribunal has completed its technical review of the equipment failure at the center of this proceeding," Doran said. "I will summarize the findings before we proceed to final testimony." He gestured, and a display activated above the central platform, showing a rotating image of the broken mask, along with columns of data in a script I could not read, though the station's translation system scrolled a simplified version along the base of the display for the benefit of non-veil observers. The mask worn by Instructor Kalinor was rated to withstand a direct strike from Coalition Standard war armor, Doran continued. A rating verified in field conditions across multiple documented conflicts. Structural analysis confirms no manufacturing defect. The material failed exactly as designed under the specific force and angle applied. A ripple of confused murmuring moved through the chamber. I felt my own confusion mirror it. If there was no defect, and it had failed exactly as designed, that meant only one thing, and I watched the realization spread across the room at roughly the same moment it settled fully into my own mind. "In simple terms," Doran said, raising his voice slightly to cut through the noise, "the mask did not fail because it was weak. It failed because the force applied to it exceeded parameters that any species previously enrolled in this training program has been capable of generating through unarmed contact." The silence that followed was absolute. "Cadet Vance," Doran said, turning toward me, "further physiological assessment was conducted following the incident, with your consent obtained through Captain Hale's office. I would like to summarize those findings as well, if you are willing." I looked at Captain Hale, who gave a small, steady nod, confirming that yes, this was the thing she had been holding back. The thing she had wanted the tribunal itself to reveal, rather than explaining it to me privately first. "Please," I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to be. "Human musculature," Doran said, particularly in moments of acute stress response, generates a documented spike in force output significantly higher than baseline measurements taken under calm conditions. This spike, sometimes referred to in human research as an adrenal response, appears to be substantially more pronounced in your species than in any other currently within the coalition. Combined with bone density and tendon structure unusual among species your size, the result under extreme stress conditions produced a strike force this equipment was never designed to withstand, because no species capable of generating it had ever been tested against it before. I sat with that for a long moment, trying to absorb what I was actually being told. It was not that the mask had been faulty. It was not that I had done something impossible through sheer will or luck. It was that every assumption the coalition had built into its equipment, its training protocols, its entire understanding of what a smaller, younger species was capable of, had simply never accounted for what a frightened, furious human body could do when pushed past its limit. "This is not an isolated finding," Doran continued, and something in his tone shifted, grew heavier, more deliberate. Following this discovery, this tribunal requested an expedited review of prior incident reports involving human cadets across all training divisions on this station. That review is not yet complete. But preliminary findings indicate a consistent pattern of underestimation in combat scenarios, equipment calibration, and disciplinary protocols applied to human recruits, based on assumptions drawn from species with far longer histories in this coalition, but very different physiologies from your own. He paused, and the chamber held its breath along with him. "In simpler terms," he said, "this coalition built an entire training framework around the belief that humans were the weakest species it had ever admitted. That belief appears to have been incorrect from the very beginning. It was simply never tested because no one expected it to be tested." I felt something shift in my chest, something I did not have a clean word for. Not quite pride, not quite vindication, something closer to a long, slow exhale after months of holding my breath without realizing it. Threx was called to respond, and for the first time since the tribunal began, his composed, clipped delivery faltered. He argued that the disciplinary strike had still been standard practice, applied equally across species regardless of physiological differences, and that he could not have reasonably anticipated an outcome no prior data suggested was possible. Administrator Doran considered this for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before. "That argument," he said, "might have held merit before this tribunal, Instructor Kallanor. It does not hold merit after. You struck a cadet under your instruction, using force you believed she was too weak to meaningfully resist, based entirely on assumption rather than evidence. The fact that your assumption was wrong does not excuse the strike. It only reveals how deeply that assumption was embedded in every decision this training program has made regarding human recruits since their admission." The chamber stayed silent for a long moment after that. I glanced toward Daniel, toward Grace, toward Owen, and saw on each of their faces the same thing I imagined was on mine. Not celebration, something quieter and more complicated than that. The particular, unsteady relief of finally being believed after months of being told, in 100 small ways, that our concerns did not matter as much as everyone else's. "This tribunal will issue formal findings within the next cycle," Doran said, addressing the full chamber now. "Instructor Kallanor's conduct will be reviewed separately under Coalition Disciplinary Code. Broader policy regarding human cadet training will be referred to full Coalition Council for reassessment. Cadet Vance," he added, turning back toward me, "you are cleared of all charges related to damage of Coalition property. This tribunal finds that your actions constituted a reasonable, proportionate response to an unlawful use of force against you." Cleared. The word did not fully register at first. I had spent 3 days bracing for a version of this proceeding that ended very differently, and hearing it end this way instead left me strangely unsteady, the way your legs feel unfamiliar after finally sitting down following a very long walk. Captain Hale's hand found my shoulder again, steady and warm, and this time she did not need to say anything at all. The chamber began to empty slowly, delegates and observers filing out in small clusters, already murmuring among themselves about what this might mean for every human cadet on the station, and, I suspected, for every human cadet who had not yet arrived. Threx remained seated a moment longer than everyone else, his masked face turned toward the now empty central platform, and for the briefest moment I found myself wondering what expression might have been underneath that mask if I could have seen it. Not fury this time. Something closer, I imagined, to the same unsteady disorientation I was feeling myself, the particular vertigo of watching a belief you had built your entire life around turn out to be wrong. I did not feel sorry for him, but I understood, in a distant way, that we were both standing in the wreckage of the same broken assumption, just from opposite sides of it. Change on a station the size of Cassandra did not arrive quickly, and it did not arrive quietly. It moved the way most real change does, in small, uneven steps, forward twice and back once, argued over in meetings I was never invited to, and decided by people I would never meet. But it moved. Within 2 weeks of the tribunal's final findings, every training hall on the station received updated equipment ratings, and for the first time since the program began, those ratings included a full set of baseline data for human physiology alongside the other 10 species already documented. I remember standing in the same training hall where everything had started, watching a Baron technician adjust the padding on a set of sparring equipment, specifically because a note in the new specifications flagged it as previously calibrated without accounting for human strike force. It was such a small, unglamorous detail. It felt, somehow, like one of the most important things I had ever witnessed. Threx Kalinor was reassigned within the month, transferred to an administrative post on a different station, far from active instruction duties. I never saw him again after the tribunal, though I heard, second-hand, that his official record now carried a formal notation regarding conduct toward human cadets, the kind of mark that would follow him through the rest of his career. I did not feel triumphant hearing that news either. Mostly I felt a kind of tired relief, the particular exhaustion of watching an old weight finally set down, even if it left other weights behind. Daniel, Grace, and Owen all remained in the program, and something had shifted between the four of us that never quite went back to what it had been before. We had always been close, the way people become close when they are struggling through something hard together. But after the tribunal, there was a different kind of trust underneath that closeness, the trust of people who had stood up together when it would have been easier not to, and had come out the other side of it still standing. Grace made squad leader within the next training cycle, the first human cadet to hold that position on Cassandra. Owen, somehow, managed to turn the entire incident into an ongoing series of jokes that made even the more reserved alien cadets in our extended squad laugh despite themselves. A skill I had come to understand was its own quiet form of leadership. Daniel simply kept asking sharp questions in every session, the same as he always had, except now, more often than not, the instructors actually stopped to answer them properly. As for me, I finished the remainder of officer training under a new combat instructor, a Cathari officer named Ves Marenko, who approached human cadets with something I had not experienced since arriving on the station, genuine, careful curiosity, rather than condescension dressed up as patience. She asked us questions about our physiology, our history, our particular strengths, not because a tribunal had ordered her to, but because she seemed to find the answers actually interesting. It was such a simple thing, being treated as worth understanding rather than worth tolerating, and I had not realized until I experienced it just how much its absence had been wearing on me for months. The broader ripples of what happened in that training hall took longer to settle, and some of them, I suspect, are still settling even now. Coalition Command issued a full revision of cadet training protocols for all newly admitted species, requiring physiological baseline testing before any disciplinary or combat calibration could be finalized. It was framed, in the official documentation, as a routine procedural update. Everyone on Cassandra understood exactly where it had come from. There was a change in the way other species looked at humans too, subtle but unmistakable. I noticed it most clearly in small moments. A Baron cadet who had always kept a wary distance from our squad began asking Daniel questions about human sparring techniques, genuinely curious rather than dismissive. An Iran delegate visiting the station specifically requested a meeting with our squad, explaining, through a slightly awkward translation, that her government wanted to better understand a species capable of generating that much force through emotion alone, since Iran culture placed enormous value on emotional restraint and found the entire concept almost fascinating. Not every reaction was warm. Some species grew more cautious around humans rather than more respectful, a wariness that occasionally shaded into something colder. I overheard, more than once, murmured conversations about whether humanity's unpredictable strength made us harder to trust rather than easier to admire. I understood that reaction too, even if I did not love it. Being underestimated had been exhausting. Being seen as a potential danger came with its own exhausting weight, just a different shape of the same old problem. The problem of being new in a room full of people who had already decided, long before we arrived, exactly how much space we were allowed to take up. But something had changed regardless, and it could not be undone. We were not going back to being the quiet, cautious newcomers who absorbed insults without comment for the sake of proving we belonged. That version of humanity's place in the coalition had ended the moment that mask came apart in my hand, whether anyone, myself included, had intended it to or not. I finished officer training 6 months after the tribunal, graduating alongside Daniel, Grace, and Owen, and nearly 30 other human cadets who had, in one way or another, weathered that same strange, difficult first class together. Captain Hale attended the graduation ceremony, standing near the back of the hall with an expression that looked, for once, entirely unguarded. Something close to pride sitting plainly on her face where I had never quite seen it before. Afterward, she found me near the edge of the gathering, away from the noise of celebration, and handed me something small and heavy, wrapped in a plain gray cloth. I unfolded it slowly and found, resting in my palm, a fragment of the original mask, the same curved section I had set down so carefully on the training hall floor all those months earlier. "Coalition record-keeping," she explained when I looked up at her, confused. "Evidence from closed tribunals is typically destroyed. I filed a request to keep this piece instead. Thought you might want it, someday, as a reminder." "A reminder of what?" I asked. "That I got lucky?" Captain Hale shook her head slowly. "A reminder that you were never as small as they assumed you were. None of us were. We just had not been tested yet." I turned the fragment over in my hand, catching the light along its smooth gray edge, and thought about the version of myself who had stepped off that transport ship 6 months earlier, terrified and determined, certain that proving herself would mean becoming quieter, smaller, more agreeable, more willing to fold herself into whatever shape the coalition expected of the newest, youngest species in the room. That was not the lesson this station had ended up teaching me after all. I kept that fragment with me through every posting that followed, through every new station, every new assignment, every new room full of species who had their own long histories of underestimating exactly what they were dealing with when a human finally decided to stop being quiet. It sat, eventually, on a shelf in my own quarters aboard my first command, a small, unremarkable piece of gray material that meant nothing to anyone who did not know its story. But I knew. And every time I looked at it, I remembered the exact moment everything changed. Not because I had planned some grand act of defiance, but because I had simply refused, in one small human moment, to stay silent when silence was expected of me. The coalition had built an entire framework of respect around centuries of careful, patient submission, a slow accumulation of proof, offered gradually, cautiously, in exchange for a seat at a table built by older, stronger, more established species. Humanity broke that pattern almost by accident, not through some grand demonstration of strength, but through the simple, stubborn refusal to accept unfair treatment quietly. The same refusal that had carried us through every hard chapter of our own history back on Earth, long before any of us ever looked up at the stars and decided we belonged among them. It took one strike, one broken mask, and one very tired, very furious cadet who had simply had enough, to prove a lesson the Coalition should have already known. A lesson every species eventually learns the hard way, when it assumes it fully understands the limits of a people it has never actually tested. We were never as small as they thought. We were only ever waiting to be pushed far enough to prove it.